Good morning. Good afternoon, sorry. This is the first time that I'm going to use some slides, so please bear with me. Okay. I'm greatly honored to be here with all of you today. UP holds a special place in my heart. It is where my mind was deeply challenged and where I held my first job as a student assistant of an esteemed English professor, the late Concepcion da Dufalsa. UP is where seeds of political dissent and also seeds of authoritarianism germinated. Jose Lava, founder of Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, studied law here. So did dictator Ferdinand Marcos. According to Marcos' late lamented propagandist Primitivo Mijares, Marcos told him that while a senior UP law student, he had written a thesis on the need for strongman rule, which he called constitutional authoritarianism. The clash of diametrically opposing ideas and views has invigorated UP for over a century. It is in this spirit that I join today's discussion on the relevance of the first EDSA people power today. It's quite relevant, especially today. The fact that President Rodrigo Duterte may be skipping the EDSA celebration, I don't know if he did. The fact that Malacanang Palace has ordered the EDSA celebration to be quiet and simple and a day of reflection, whatever that means, and the fact that the palace will not stage the traditional salubungan, which commemorates, sorry, I forgot all about the slides. Could you flash the first slide, please? Okay, this is, for those who remember, this is the UP Diliman Commune. When the students barricaded the front of UP, the oblation, and called it the Diliman Republic. Okay. Okay. The fact that the palace will not stage the traditional salubungan, which commemorates coming together of renegade forces that had broken away from the Marcos dictatorship and which culminates with the jumping of joy of General Fidel Ramos at the false news that Marcos had fled. All of these show a concerted effort on the part of the Duterte administration to dumb down the significance of EDSA in Philippine history and erase EDSA from the collective memory of the Filipino people. I'd like to show some slides of the Edsa Revolution. These were taken by my friend, photojournalist Sunny Camarillo. Okay, this is where Ramos and Enrile were about. This is just before, I think, they jumped for joy. And you can see in the background their mascot, the Blessed Virgin. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to emphasize with this slide, you know, it was the people and the religious, really, that made EDSA what it was. It was the people who protected the military and not the other way around. The fact that they are going to hold the EDSA celebration inside Camp Aguinaldo is itself a revisionism of history. Next slide, please. Okay, this is again from that era. Next slide. You can see, you know, this was taken in the early morning hours after they had come together and then they were praying. You can see how scared these two men were. They were, they were praying that they would live. They would outlive Marcos. This is the first time you're seeing this. Of course, I put it in my book, Marcos Martial Law. Next slide, please. This is where the generals were all huddled inside the office of General Fidel Ramos. I was covering as a newbie reporter. I went to Camp Crame, and that's where I first met Fidel Ramos. Okay, I'm not sure if there's another slide. Okay. Go back na lang muna. Sorry. Okay. Duterte is a politician who cherry-picks from history to suit his political purpose. Yesterday, on the eve of the EDSA commemoration, he chose to give a speech before the Knights of Rizal and extolling the national hero for advocating a federal form of government for the country. The palace saw no contradiction in the fact that their excuse for celebrating EDSA quietly was that it's time to move on from just celebrating the past, remembering the past, when here was the president dwelling on an even more distant past. Presidential spokesman Ernesto Abella's explanation on why EDSA should be celebrated quietly actually hit the nail right on the head why EDSA remains very relevant to this day. Abella said, "It is time to move on from EDSA," and to quote him, "Move on from the whole aspect, move on to the whole aspect of nation building, to give it a more positive outlook and to give a more positive understanding." This implies that EDSA was not about nation building and its outlook was not that positive. Why does the Duterte administration look at EDSA that way? Perhaps because EDSA is all about making abhorrent leaders accountable and booting them out if they abuse their power. Perhaps because President Duterte is a Marcos loyalist and an admirer of the strongman. His dream seems to be to bring back various aspects of the Marcos rule. Ramos, the hero of EDSA, was right on the money when he said that the subdued celebration was not moving on, but moving back in time. And he observed, that is also, I think, by design to subdue it further. What does the design consist of? In the last few months, details have been emerging. For instance, the planned parliamentary federal form of government that has been presented to congressional leaders would have a dual executive, according to University of Santo Tomas Assistant Professor Ed Muntayaw, meaning there would be a president elected directly by the people for a 5-year term. He can run for re-election for another 5-year term. At the same time, there would be a prime minister who is a member of parliament and who will serve as head of government. He will be elected by fellow members of parliament. He will run the day-to-day operations of government. That setup is definitely moving back in time. That setup copies the Marcos-Cesar Virata tandem, where Marcos was a strong president and Virata was the workhorse prime minister who ran the government. What exactly was the role of the president in Marcos' parliamentary system? Pretty much what he's doing under the current presidential form. And what was the Prime Minister's role under Marcos' parliamentary system? Article 9 of the 1973 Constitution, I got it from here. This is a UP Law Center publication in 1988, defines the Prime Minister role. It states that there shall be a cabinet which shall be composed of ministers with or without portfolio appointed by the President. Most of the cabinet members who head ministries should come from Batasang Pambansa, meaning the Parliament. Article 9 then adds that the Prime Minister shall be the head of the cabinet. He shall, upon the nomination of the President from among members of the Batasang Pambansa, be elected by a majority of all members therefore. Under such a setup, what you will have is a very strong president without checks and balances. Unlike the Marcos system, Duterte's setup, according to Professor Edmund Tayaw, will scrap the position of vice president. Tayaw's group has not explained the succession formula in case the president dies. Who do you think Duterte's prime minister and successor is likely to be? Most probably, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos. During the vice presidential debate in April, Bongbong disclosed what Duterte had promised him. Sinabi ni Mayor Digong, kapag hindi nalutas ang problema ng krimen in 3 to 6 months, ibibigay na raw niya ang pagkapangulo kay Bongbong. Hindi niya sinabing ibibigay niya kay Senator Alan. On the part of Marcos, in 19 was allergic to vice presidents, having quarreled with his vice president, Fernando Lopez, whom he accused of plotting against him. Sounds familiar. The 1986 EDSA People Power put an end to Marcos' semi-presidential parliamentary setup and restored the presidential form of government with all its checks and balances. Duterte has made no bones about his deep dislike for checks and balances. In August last year, Duterte threatened to declare martial law if Chief Justice Lourdes Sereno stopped his war on drugs. In the same month, Duterte also threatened to shut down Congress if it bungled his plan to change the Constitution and set up a parliamentary federal system. The fruit of the 1986 EDSA People Power is the 1987 Constitution. He wants to change that too. In August 2015, Duterte told Philippine Daily Inquirer that, open quotes, the wellspring of corruption is the Constitution itself, because the Constitution limits presidential powers on, open quotes, all money matters and budget appropriations, close quotes. Duterte said that in contrast, a mayor, like he was in Davao City, was not hamstrung by the Constitution in shaking up state bureaucracy from the head down to the janitor. His own presidential legal counsel, Salvador Panelo, has openly talked about Duterte setting up a constitutional authoritarianism. By the way, Marcos called his form of government constitutional authoritarianism. What Panelo had in mind, he told Karen Davila on her show Head Start on September 15, 2016, close to the anniversary of Marcos' declaration of martial law. Panelo told Davila that he was proposing would be constitutional because, and I quote, "You revise the Constitution, give the powers to the President, legislative and executive powers. So in a sense, parang dictatorship kasi dalawa ang powers niya, pero constitutional eh." In effect, Panelo is proposing to bring back for Duterte Ferdinand Marcos Amendment Number 6 power. Amendment 6 enabled Marcos to legislate laws on his own. Amendment Number 6 was the sixth amendment that Marcos himself introduced to the 1973 Constitution. It stated that whenever in the judgment of the President there exists a grave emergency or a threat of imminence thereof, or whenever the interim Batasang Pambansa or the regular National Assembly fails or is unable to act adequately on any matter for any reason that in the judgment that in his judgment requires immediate action, he may, in order to meet the exigency, issue the necessary decrees, orders, or letters of instruction which shall form part of the law of the land. I'd like to greet General Jose Almonte. He's just here. Just going back to my experience in EDSA, there was a point when I was in Camp Crame on the second day. General Ramos and all his generals were there in the room, and suddenly General Ramos tells us very calmly, all the media were present there, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should go down immediately. The tanks are coming." All of us scuttled downstairs, and I was wondering, where do you go if the tanks were coming? How do you, secure yourself? And then, that was, suddenly, while I was trying to rush along a corridor, I see this military officer. He was very, very casually leaning on the wall like that. And then I eavesdropped. He was talking to somebody. And he said, "The people stopped the tanks." I could not imagine what that meant. I thought the person who said that, was the ugliest handsome man I ever saw. And that was General Almonte. I was not introduced to him. I didn't introduce myself to him at that time because I was in awe. Him telling the others, the one he was talking to very casually, the people stopped the tanks. Okay. Sorry, where was I? Okay. Panelo said that setup of what he called a constitutional dictatorship will not be illegal because such powers will be embedded in the new constitution to replace the present one. Panelo rationalized giving Duterte such sweeping powers this way. Kaya ko pinopropose yon because palaging nagfe-fail ang presidente natin eh. At yon ang laging sinasabi. We need this power, we need that. So sabi ko, dibigyan na lang natin so there is no more excuse not to fail. You can find all of this on the internet. But the problem with that argument is Marcos himself failed devastatingly despite wielding such awesome powers. Duterte and Panelo's pronouncements have indicated to me that both men are firm disciples of Ferdinand Marcos' ideology of unbridled, arrogant power for its own sake. In Ferdinand Marcos' book entitled In Search of Alternatives, The Third World in an Age of Crisis, published by the National Media Production Center in 1980, Marcos expounded on his idea of constitutional authoritarianism. On page 154, he said, "So, constitutional authoritarianism is the third way, not a compromise between dictatorship and democracy, but the disciplined way to democracy." Marcos called constitutional authoritarianism as the third alternative for developing nations. You can also see from Presidential Legal Counsel Salvador Panelo's explanation that the constitutional authoritarianism, the constitutional dictatorship they have in mind will be dressed in a parliamentary federal garb. What they have in mind is not really a parliamentary federal setup like that of France. What they have in mind is a strongman rule just like what Marcos had. The parliamentary federal plan will just be the come on to get people like former Senator Aquilino Pimentel Jr., his son, Senate President Coco Pimentel, the Muslims, particularly the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, to support the scrapping of the present 1987 Constitution with a new one tailored to Duterte's desires for more power. I would like to clarify that both Pimentels, father and son, have long lobbied for a federal setup, but never for a constitutional dictatorship. In fact, when I once asked Senator Nene Pimentel why the late President Corazon Aquino never wielded the awesome powers she had as head of a revolutionary government under the 1986 Freedom Constitution in order to carry out sweeping reforms, his reply to me was that we wanted to be the opposite of Marcos. Ironically, Pimentel has just fielded someone who wants to be Marcos version 2. And it's easy to do that too. As I told a recent international conference of the UP Third World Studies, a sweeping change of the Constitution will necessitate a transition period. During that transition period, whoever is in charge will wield awesome powers, just like what Marcos had in 1973 and just like what Cory Aquino had in 1986. Marcos used his awesome powers to transition from a presidential democratic form of government to a dictatorship disguised as a semi-presidential parliamentary setup. Duterte says he is changing the Constitution for the good of the Filipino people and the next generation. But he defines good in a different way. For instance, to him, killing drug addicts, pushers, and traffickers without due process is good for society. Finally, there is another thing I observed about Duterte, only because I was writing my book, Marcos Martial Law, Never Again. After he won the presidency last year, I was startled to hear him say a particular phrase which I had encountered during the research on my book on Marcos atrocities. On May 17, 2016, after the New York-based Human Rights Watch had raised an alarm over the Davao death squad, Duterte sarcastically said, "If criminals in the book of these foreigners have their human rights, peace-loving citizens should also be entitled to some human wrongs to protect themselves." Next slide, please. Okay. His use of the phrase human wrongs rang a bell in my mind. I knew I had read the exact same phrase, human wrongs, somewhere. Going back to the mountains of documents I had used, I found that the narration of 36-year-old Noel Etabag, which he had secretly given to the task force detainees of the Philippines about his arrest and torture in 1982. Etabag wrote, "I was dragged into another room and the tactical interrogation began. The man who first approached me said, 'Don't think that we will not hurt you. We have no human rights here, only human wrong. Carter is no longer president, it's Reagan now. You talk and we will not hurt you. Do you know that we can easily liquidate you now? Nobody knows that we have arrested you, and nobody knows that you were brought here." Then the round-faced man rained powerful blows on my abdomen and ribs, said Etabag. Next slide, please. Sorry, go there. That's Noel Etabag. He was the one who secretly gave his affidavit on how he was tortured to the task force detainees. Okay. Duterte shares the same mindset as Etabag's torturer. He has buried Marcos at the Hero Cemetery, saying the charges of abuse against the dictator has yet to be proven. This book that I wrote, I decided to write it because I felt that history was being revised. This is mainly about the torture and atrocities during Marcos martial law. Now, let me share with you some of the images that I put in the book. Next slide, please. This is called the monkey house. That's where, you arrest someone and you put that person there under the sun. And he has to stay there for days. Next slide. This is one of the favorite torture methods, the water cure. There are a lot of people who have been water cured that you know. Joma Sison told me water cure was used with him. Eta Rosales also told me that water cure was used on her. Next slide. This is a victim of a massacre in Bulacan. Next slide. This is what you would call now the Escalante Massacre. This is the massacre of the farmers. Next slide. This is a massacre of a family in Mindanao. Next slide. And you know who this is. Duterte, okay, all these are points to ponder on this day of reflection on the first EDSA people power. That's all.